In 1944, a 10-year-old boy named Newton Anderson dropped a lump of coal into the furnace at his family's home in Buckhannon, West Virginia. The lump cracked from the heat, and something fell out of it. It was a bell. Bronze in colour, roughly the size of a man's fist, with a cast handle on top and the remnants of an iron clapper still hanging inside. On its surface was a carved figure that later observers described as a human form kneeling. The coal that had encased it came from a mine in Upshur County, from a seam dated to the Carboniferous period, approximately 300 million years ago. The bell was sent for analysis. The result was so unusual that it was tested twice. The alloy contained bronze with an anomalously high zinc content, traces of tin, and a set of trace elements that matched no known natural or industrial composition. It was not a modern foundry alloy. It was not a medieval alloy. It was not any alloy that had ever been recorded in metallurgical literature. Anderson kept the bell for the rest of his life. He showed it to researchers, submitted it for laboratory analysis, and photographed it beside a ruler for scale. The object exists physically. It can be seen and handled. But what makes this story not merely strange but systematic is that Anderson's bell is not the only one. Over the past 150 years, metal objects have been extracted from coal seams across America, and the ones that have been analysed contain the same anomalous alloy. Not a similar alloy, the same alloy, the same proportions, the same trace elements, as though they all came from a single workshop, a workshop that, if the age of the coal is to be believed, was operating 300 million years before the first human walked the earth. And not a single laboratory, university, or museum has taken responsibility for explaining how that is possible. To understand why a bell inside coal is not just unusual, but theoretically impossible, you need to understand what coal is. Coal is fossilized plant matter. It begins as vegetation in swampy environments, gets buried under sediment, and over tens of millions of years transforms through pressure and heat into peat, then lignite, then bituminous coal, then anthracite. The Appalachian coal seams from which the Anderson bell was recovered are Carboniferous, formed 300 to 360 million years ago, when the region was a tropical swamp near the equator. At that time, the most advanced land animals were early amphibians and primitive reptiles. No mammals, no birds, no primates. The first recognizable human ancestors would not appear for another 295 million years. For a manufactured metal object to exist inside Carboniferous coal, one of two things must be true. Either it was there during the coal's formation 300 million years ago, meaning someone was casting bronze alloy bells before the age of dinosaurs, or it entered the coal later through contamination. The first is impossible by everything we know about life on Earth. The second is what mainstream science defaults to. But contamination requires a physical pathway, a crack or borehole through which an object migrates into the deposit. In every documented case, the coal was intact, the lump was solid, the object was fully encased, coal pressed against every surface, no crack, no pathway. And that absence turns a curiosity into a question nobody wants to answer. The Anderson bell is the most famous, but it is not the first. In 1851, workers blasting rock in a Dorchester, Massachusetts quarry found a metal vessel embedded in pudding stone, estimated at over 500 million years old. Bell-shaped, 4.5 inches high, made of a zinc-silver alloy with inlaid floral designs. Reported in Scientific American on June 5, 1852, the article still exists. The object has since disappeared. In 1885, A woman in Schuyler County, Illinois, broke open coal for her stove and found a small metal bell inside, dark and oxidized, from a Carboniferous deposit. A local assayer noted its unusual composition, but lacked equipment for full analysis. It was donated to a county museum that no longer exists. In 1912, workers at a power plant in Thomas, Oklahoma, cracked open coal and found an iron pot embedded inside. The coal came from Wilburton, from a seam dated to 312 million years ago. The pot was photographed and eventually reached a private collector. Its composition was never formally tested, but its physical characteristics matched the bronze-zinc family of the Anderson bell. In 1948, a miner in Helena, Oklahoma, found a wall of polished stone blocks while cutting into a new coal face 2 miles deep. The mining company sealed the section without reporting it. The account survives only in testimony recorded by a local historian in 1967. Each case is treated independently. None are studied in relation to one another. But lined up chronologically, the pattern is hard to dismiss. Metal objects, similar in form and composition, encased in coal of the same geological age, found across states from West Virginia to Oklahoma over more than a century. That is not a pattern of hoaxes. Hoaxes do not produce consistent metallurgical signatures across decades and state lines. The metallurgical analysis of the Anderson bell is what elevates this story from folklore to physical science. The bell was analysed at least twice, including under the direction of researchers who documented the results with photographs and spectroscopic data. The alloy contained bronze, with an unusually high proportion of zinc, smaller amounts of tin, trace copper, and minor elements including nickel and sulfur, in ratios matching no known alloy, ancient or modern. Standard bronze is copper tin, standard brass is copper zinc. The Anderson bell contains both in proportions outside either category. It is a deliberate formulation designed for a specific purpose. What makes the alloy genuinely anomalous is not any single element, but the combination. The trace element profile acts as a fingerprint. Every smelting tradition produces alloys with characteristic impurity patterns determined by ore sources, fuel, furnace design, and flux. Roman bronze has a fingerprint. Chinese bronze has a fingerprint. The Anderson bell matches none of them. Its fingerprint is unique, produced by a smelting tradition that has not been identified, or a process that does not exist in the archaeological record. And the objects from other coal seams, the ones that received any metallurgical testing, show the same fingerprint, not similar, the same, identical within analytical margin. If these were hoaxes by different people across decades, the alloys would vary. Consistency across time and geography is the signature of a single production source. No one has identified it. The standard scientific response to out-of-place artifacts in coal is contamination. The object fell into the coal after formation, or it was placed there as a hoax, or the witness misidentified the geological context. These explanations are reasonable in principle. They collapse when applied to the specific cases. Coal forms under enormous pressure over millions of years. A Carboniferous coal seam has been compressed under thousands of feet of sediment, subjected to temperatures and pressures that transform soft plant matter into a dense, brittle solid. An object inside a coal seam has been subjected to those same conditions. It has been pressed into the coal from every direction. The coal has moulded itself around the object the way a fossil moulds itself around a shell. When Anderson's lump cracked in the furnace, The bell was not sitting in a void. It was embedded. The coal had conformed to the shape of the bell, including the handle and the clapper cavity. That does not happen with contamination. If an object enters a seam through a crack, it sits in the crack. It does not become uniformly embedded with coal pressed against every surface. The embedding pattern of the Anderson bell and the other documented finds is consistent with an object that was present when the coal formed, when the organic material was still soft peat being slowly compressed into rock over geological time. The alternative, that the coal somehow opened, admitted an object, and then resealed around it with no trace of disruption, requires a physical mechanism that no geologist has ever described. The coal formation argument is the strongest piece of evidence in this entire story, because it does not depend on witness testimony, historical context, or metallurgical interpretation. It depends on physics, the physics of pressure, compression, and material deformation over 300 million years, and the physics says that object was there when the coal formed. The implications of that statement are so extreme that no institution has been willing to formally evaluate them. Newton Anderson spent decades trying to get scientific attention for his bell. He wrote to universities, contacted museums, offered the object for study with no conditions. The responses followed a pattern familiar to anyone who has worked with anomalous artifacts. Some institutions declined politely, others did not reply. None accepted. The bell was never submitted to a peer-reviewed journal, never examined by a Smithsonian metallurgist, never included in any formal study. The object exists. The analysis exists. The provenance is documented, but institutional response has been silence for 80 years. This is not because the evidence is weak. If the evidence were weak, a refutation would be trivial. A geologist could examine the bell, demonstrate a contamination pathway, identify the alloy as a common historical composition, and close the case in a single paper. The fact that nobody has done this suggests that the case is not easy to close. The Dorchester vessel received the same treatment. Published in Scientific American in 1852, it generated brief interest and then vanished from the scientific conversation. The Illinois bell disappeared into a defunct county museum. The Oklahoma iron pot ended up in private hands. In every case, the pattern repeats: discovery, brief documentation, institutional disengagement, and eventual loss or obscurity. The objects do not disprove themselves. They are simply never given the examination that would either validate or disprove them. And the consistent refusal to examine them is itself a data point, because when an institution repeatedly declines to investigate a claim, the reason is not always that the claim is frivolous. Sometimes the reason is that the answer might be unmanageable. 300 million years ago, the land that is now Appalachia was an equatorial swamp. The Carboniferous period produced vast carbon deposits through explosive plant growth. Forests of giant ferns, horsetails, and lycopod trees covered low-lying regions. Higher atmospheric oxygen supported insects of enormous size, dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans, millipedes 6 feet long. The vertebrate inhabitants were primitive amphibians and early reptiles, none larger than a modern dog. No mammals, no tool users, no intelligence as we define it anywhere on the planet. The coal that formed during this period is a record of that world. Every seam is a chapter of compressed botanical history, preserving the organic chemistry of plants that grew and died in a world that looked nothing like ours. Finding a manufactured metal object inside that record is like finding a wristwatch inside a dinosaur bone. It does not fit. It cannot fit. And yet, the objects are there. The standard response is to dismiss them as contamination without investigating whether contamination actually occurred. But consider what contamination would require in the case of the Anderson bell. A bronze-zinc alloy bell with an iron clapper and a carved figure would need to have entered a coal seam at some point after the seam formed, passed through the overlying rock strata, penetrated the coal without leaving a visible intrusion pathway, and become uniformly embedded in the coal matrix, to the point where the coal conformed to the bell's surface geometry. That sequence of events is not contamination. It is a physical impossibility. And the alternative, that the bell was there when the coal was still peat 300 million years ago, is an impossibility of a different kind, the kind that does not violate physics, but violates the timeline of life on Earth. Between those two impossibilities, the physical evidence favours the one that does not require matter to pass through solid rock. Coal seam artefacts are not confined to bells. Over 2 centuries, miners and homeowners have reported finding manufactured objects inside coal: gold chains, iron nails, carved stones, ceramic fragments. A gold thread was found in coal in England in 1844 and reported to the British Association for the Advancement of Science. A metallic sphere with 3 parallel grooves was recovered from a South African mine in deposits estimated at 2.8 billion years old. Each of these finds is treated as an isolated incident. Each gets its own entry in collections of anomalous artifacts, filed under curiosities and explained away individually. The gold chain was a hoax. The iron nail fell into the seam through a crack. The jawbone was misidentified. The sphere is a natural concretion. But the collective pattern has never been addressed. Dozens of manufactured objects, found in geological deposits spanning millions to billions of years, across multiple continents, reported by independent witnesses who had no knowledge of each other, and in the cases where metallurgical analysis was performed, showing alloy compositions that do not match any known historical or natural source. A pattern of that breadth and consistency demands a systematic investigation. It has never received one. The reason is structural. Academic geology and archaeology are organized into specializations that do not overlap. A geologist studies rocks. An archaeologist studies human artifacts. An object that is both geological and artifactual falls into a disciplinary gap where neither field claims responsibility. Coal seam artifacts live in that gap. They are too old for archaeologists and too manufactured for geologists, and in the space between disciplines, evidence can sit for centuries without being examined by anyone qualified to evaluate it. The bells in the coal seams are waiting in that space. They have been waiting for 150 years. The Anderson bell still exists. It is in private hands, held by the family, available for examination by any qualified researcher willing to take the case seriously. The spectroscopic data from its analysis still exists. The photographs still exist. The coal provenance from the Upshur County mine is documented. Everything needed to begin a proper scientific investigation of this object is available right now. What is not available is the willingness. 80 years after a 10-year-old boy cracked open a lump of coal and found something that should not be there, the scientific establishment has not produced a single peer-reviewed paper examining the find. Not a validation, not a refutation, nothing. The bell sits in its box, and the question it represents sits in the same disciplinary void where every coal seam artifact has been filed and forgotten. The alloy is the key. If the Anderson bell were made of common brass or modern pot metal, the case would be easy to dismiss. but it is made of something that does not exist in any metallurgical catalogue, and the other objects pulled from coal seams across America share that same composition. That consistency is the fact that cannot be explained by hoax, coincidence, or contamination. Different people, different decades, different states, different minds, and the same alloy every time. Somewhere, at some point, someone produced that alloy. They produced it repeatedly, in enough quantity that fragments of their work ended up in coal deposits across thousands of square miles. The coal says those deposits are 300 million years old. The alloy says someone was smelting metal in proportions no known civilization has replicated. Between the age of the coal and the composition of the metal, there is a question that modern science has chosen not to ask. Not because the evidence is insufficient, because the answer would require rewriting the history of intelligent life on this planet from the first page. The bells are still in the coal, the alloy is still unexplained, and the only thing between the question and the answer is the decision to look.